There exists a moment in every thinking person's life when they realize that most of what they've been taught about human nature is fundamentally incomplete. Not necessarily wrong, but incomplete in a way that leaves them perpetually surprised by outcomes they should have anticipated. This moment of recognition is both liberating and burdensome, because once you truly begin to observe human behavior rather than simply experience it, you cannot unsee what reveals itself. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this burden 5 centuries ago when he wrote that, "Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel." He wasn't being cynical when he made this observation. He was being scientific. Machiavelli approached human behavior the way a physician approaches symptoms, seeking to understand the actual mechanisms at work rather than what we might prefer those mechanisms to be. This is where most people falter. They confuse observation with judgment, analysis with criticism. They mistake the study of power dynamics for the endorsement of manipulation. But there is a profound difference between understanding how something works and deciding how to use that understanding. A surgeon who comprehends human anatomy isn't automatically a torturer, and a person who recognizes patterns in human behavior isn't necessarily a manipulator. What Machiavelli discovered, and what you're about to explore, is that human behavior follows predictable patterns that reveal themselves once you know what to look for. These patterns exist whether you acknowledge them or not. The question isn't whether these dynamics are at play in your daily life. The question is whether you're conscious of them or unconsciously subject to them. Consider your last week of interactions. How many times did someone present themselves one way in public and behave differently when they thought no one was watching? How many times did you witness someone make decisions based not on their stated values but on their unstated fears? How many times did you observe people grant respect not to the most virtuous person in the room but to the one who demonstrated the most consequence? These aren't moral failings. These are human patterns. And patterns, once recognized, become predictable. The ancient Greeks had a concept called phronesis, practical wisdom. It referred to the ability to discern the right course of action in particular circumstances. But you cannot develop practical wisdom if you operate from incomplete information about how human nature actually functions. You cannot make wise decisions if you base those decisions on how you wish people behaved rather than how they actually behave. This is why Machiavelli's observations remain relevant centuries later. He was mapping human nature, not prescribing behavior. He was documenting what he observed in the courts of Florence, in the strategies of successful princes, in the rise and fall of republics. His conclusions weren't theories. They were field notes from extended observation of power in practice. And here's what he observed that challenges comfortable assumptions about human nature. People respond more predictably to consequences than to principles, more consistently to demonstrated capability than to declared intentions, more reliably to clear boundaries than to unlimited tolerance. This doesn't make people evil. It makes them human. But once you begin to observe these patterns consciously, everything changes. You start to notice the difference between what people say they value and what their actions reveal they actually value. You begin to recognize when someone's kindness comes from strength versus when it comes from an inability to establish boundaries. You develop the ability to distinguish between respect that's given freely and respect that's extracted through demonstrated competence. The most successful people in any field understand these distinctions intuitively. They don't necessarily articulate them, and they certainly don't advertise them, but they operate from this understanding. They recognize that influence isn't granted to the most deserving person in the room. It's granted to the person who best understands how influence actually works. This recognition creates a choice. You can continue operating from incomplete information about human nature, wondering why your good intentions don't always produce the outcomes you expect. Or you can begin to develop what we might call observer consciousness. The ability to see the patterns that govern human behavior without being unconsciously subject to them. This isn't about becoming manipulative. It's about becoming conscious. It's about understanding the game that's already being played all around you, every day, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. But awareness comes with responsibility. Once you begin to see these patterns clearly, you cannot pretend they don't exist. Once you understand how influence actually works, you must decide how you'll use that understanding. The question becomes not whether you'll acknowledge these dynamics, but how you'll choose to engage with them. And that choice, that conscious decision about how to apply your growing understanding of human nature, is where we encounter our first glimpse of what real weakness looks like versus what we've been conditioned to believe weakness is. You've been taught to confuse weakness with gentleness, vulnerability with openness, and strength with aggression. These misunderstandings don't just limit your effectiveness. They make you predictable to those who understand the actual mechanics of human behavior. Real weakness, in Machiavellian terms, isn't kindness or compassion or the desire to help others. Real weakness is inconsistency between your stated values and your practical decisions. It's the gap between what you claim to prioritize and what your actions reveal you actually prioritize when pressure is applied. Machiavelli observed this pattern repeatedly in his analysis of failed princes and collapsed republics. It wasn't their virtues that destroyed them. It was their inability to maintain consistency between their ideals and their decisions when circumstances demanded practical wisdom. They would proclaim one set of values in times of peace and abandon those values entirely when faced with difficult choices, creating confusion among allies and opportunities for enemies. This inconsistency is what creates vulnerability in modern contexts as well. Think about someone you know who constantly talks about work-life balance but consistently sacrifices personal relationships for professional advancement. Or consider someone who advocates for honesty but regularly withholds important information when transparency might create uncomfortable conversations. The weakness isn't in their professional ambition or their desire to avoid conflict. The weakness is in the inconsistency, which makes their behavior unpredictable to themselves and manipulable by others who recognize the pattern. Here's what most people miss about this dynamic. Others can sense inconsistency even when they can't articulate it. When someone's actions regularly contradict their stated values, it creates an instinctive distrust that operates below conscious awareness. People may not be able to explain why they don't quite trust that person, but they respond to the inconsistency by withholding respect, confidence, or genuine cooperation. Conversely, when someone maintains consistency between their stated principles and their actual decisions, even when those decisions are difficult or unpopular, they generate what Machiavelli called virtù, a quality that combines moral character with practical effectiveness. This consistency creates predictability in the best sense. Others know what to expect, which paradoxically makes them more likely to grant influence and cooperation. But here's where it becomes complex. Maintaining this consistency requires you to either live by principles you can actually sustain under pressure, or honestly acknowledge when you're choosing practical necessity over stated ideals. Both approaches can work, but the middle ground, where you claim to live by principles you'll abandon when tested, creates the inconsistency that others unconsciously recognize as weakness. Consider how this plays out in professional environments. You've undoubtedly encountered managers who talk about collaboration while making unilateral decisions, who emphasize team input while consistently implementing their predetermined preferences, who advocate for transparency while strategically withholding information that might challenge their position. The problem isn't their desire for control or their strategic thinking. The problem is the inconsistency between what they claim to value and how they actually operate. This inconsistency doesn't just damage their credibility. It teaches everyone around them that stated values are negotiable when convenient, which paradoxically makes it harder for these managers to achieve their actual objectives because no one trusts the framework they're operating within. Now contrast this with someone who clearly states their priorities and maintains consistency with those priorities even when it's difficult. They might say, "I value team input on implementation, but strategic direction decisions rest with me." Or, "I'll share information that helps you do your job effectively, but I won't compromise the competitive position by over-communicating strategic plans." The clarity creates predictability, which generates respect even from those who might prefer different priorities. This is why Machiavelli emphasized that it's better to be consistently firm than inconsistently gentle. Not because firmness is superior to gentleness, but because consistency creates the predictability that allows others to engage with you productively. When your responses are consistent with your stated values, others know what to expect and can adjust their approach accordingly. But weakness in this framework isn't just about individual inconsistency. It's also about failing to recognize when others are operating from inconsistent principles. When you assume everyone operates from the same level of consistency between values and actions, you make yourself vulnerable to those who understand this disconnect and use it strategically. The person who talks about mutual benefit while consistently prioritizing their own interests isn't necessarily evil. But if you base your decisions on their stated commitment to mutual benefit rather than their demonstrated pattern of self-prioritization, you're operating from incomplete information. You're allowing their inconsistency to create vulnerability in your decision-making process. This recognition doesn't require you to become cynical or to assume the worst about everyone. It requires you to develop what we might call pattern recognition, the ability to observe whether someone's actions align with their stated values over time, and to base your decisions on demonstrated patterns rather than proclaimed intentions. But here's what's crucial to understand. Recognizing these patterns in others is only half of developing practical wisdom. The more challenging half is recognizing these patterns in yourself, acknowledging where your own stated values might not align with your actual decision-making when tested, and consciously choosing either to adjust your values to match your actions or to adjust your actions to match your values. Because true strength, the kind that creates lasting influence and genuine respect, emerges not from avoiding this self-examination, but from completing it honestly and making conscious choices about who you choose to be when tested. The most dangerous assumption you can make about power is that it looks like what you expect it to look like. Real strength often appears as restraint. Genuine influence frequently presents as quiet competence. And the people with the most consequential authority are rarely the ones making the most noise about their authority. This is Machiavelli's most sophisticated insight, though it's often misunderstood. When he wrote about the necessity of appearing strong, he wasn't advocating for theatrical displays of power. He was observing that true strength must sometimes be demonstrated to prevent having to use it, while false strength must constantly be performed because it can't be demonstrated. Consider the difference between these two approaches to authority. The person who regularly reminds others of their position, who emphasizes hierarchy in conversations, who requires constant acknowledgement of their status. This person is performing strength because they lack the substance that would make performance unnecessary. Their authority depends on others' recognition of their authority, which makes it fundamentally fragile. Contrast this with someone whose competence creates natural deference, whose consistency generates trust, whose decision-making capability makes others genuinely want their input. This person's influence exists whether it's acknowledged or not, which makes it fundamentally stable. The paradox is this: real strength can afford to appear gentle because it doesn't depend on appearance for its effectiveness. False strength must always appear strong because appearance is all it has. This dynamic plays out in countless ways in modern life. You've encountered both types in your professional experience. The manager who leads through demonstrated competence versus the manager who leads through title enforcement. The team member whose insights consistently prove valuable versus the team member who insists their insights should be valued because of their credentials. The difference isn't in their official position or even in their stated qualifications. It's in whether their influence is earned through results or demanded through protocol. But here's what makes this particularly relevant to your daily interactions. Understanding this distinction allows you to calibrate your responses appropriately. When someone's authority comes from competence and consistency, engaging with that authority productively serves your interests. When someone's authority comes primarily from position and performance, you need different strategies for productive engagement. Machiavelli observed that successful princes understood this instinctively. They knew when to defer to genuine expertise and when to manage theatrical authority carefully. They recognized that challenging competent authority wastes energy and creates unnecessary conflict, while failing to appropriately manage performative authority creates different kinds of problems. This requires you to develop what we might call authority assessment, the ability to quickly recognize what type of influence you're dealing with in any given interaction. Is this person's authority based on demonstrated capability, official position, social dynamics, or some combination? And how does understanding that foundation inform your most effective approach to the interaction? For example, when dealing with someone whose influence comes primarily from expertise, direct engagement with their ideas tends to be productive. They're confident enough in their competence to handle disagreement or alternative perspectives. When dealing with someone whose influence comes primarily from position, direct challenge often backfires because it threatens the foundation of their authority. More effective approaches might involve questions that allow them to maintain position while arriving at better decisions. But the most sophisticated aspect of this understanding is recognizing it in yourself. What type of influence do you actually have in various contexts? Is your authority based on demonstrated competence, official position, social relationships, or something else? And how does understanding your own foundation of influence inform your most effective approaches to exercising it? This self-awareness matters because trying to exercise authority you don't actually have creates the inconsistency we explored earlier. If your influence comes primarily from expertise but you try to exercise it through position, you appear presumptuous. If your influence comes from relationships but you try to exercise it through expertise claims, you appear overconfident. Matching your approach to your actual foundation of influence increases effectiveness while maintaining authenticity. Here's where it becomes genuinely complex. Most people have different types of influence in different contexts, and effectiveness requires accurately assessing which type applies in each situation. You might have expertise-based authority in your professional specialty, relationship-based influence in your family dynamics, and position-based authority in certain organizational contexts. Confusing these frameworks creates the kind of inconsistency that others unconsciously recognize as weakness. The most effective people navigate these distinctions fluidly. They exercise expertise-based authority when their competence is relevant, defer to others' expertise when it's superior, use position-based authority when structure serves the situation, and build relationship-based influence through consistent trustworthiness. They don't insist on one type of authority in all contexts, which allows them to be more effective across diverse situations. But this fluidity requires genuine self-knowledge about your actual capabilities, relationships, and position in various contexts. It requires honesty about when you do and don't have legitimate authority, and wisdom about which type of influence best serves each situation you encounter. This level of self-awareness and contextual intelligence is what Machiavelli meant by virtù. Not virtue in the moral sense, but excellence in the practical sense. The ability to accurately assess situations and respond with the approach most likely to achieve constructive outcomes. And this practical excellence becomes essential as you begin to recognize not just the patterns of strength and weakness in yourself and others, but the ethical implications of acting on this recognition. Now we arrive at the question that determines whether your growing understanding of human nature serves constructive purposes or destructive ones. What do you do with accurate observations about power, influence, and the patterns that govern human behavior? This is where most discussions of Machiavellian thinking go wrong. They assume that understanding how influence works automatically leads to exploiting that knowledge for selfish purposes. But this assumption reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what Machiavelli actually advocated and why his insights remain valuable. Machiavelli wrote The Prince as a manual for effective leadership during a period when incompetent leadership was destroying Italian city-states and causing immense human suffering. His observations about power weren't intended to help people manipulate others for personal gain. They were intended to help leaders govern effectively enough to maintain stability and protect their citizens from the chaos that results from weak or inconsistent governance. This distinction matters because it points to the ethical framework that should guide how you apply your understanding of human nature. Does your application of this knowledge serve larger purposes, or does it serve only immediate personal advantage? Consider the difference between these two approaches to recognizing someone's inconsistency between stated values and actual behavior. You could use that recognition to manipulate their inconsistency for your benefit, creating situations where their stated values pressure them into decisions that serve your interests. Or you could use that recognition to engage with them based on their actual priorities rather than their stated ones, creating more honest and productive interactions for everyone involved. The first approach treats people as means to your ends. The second approach treats people as they actually are rather than as they present themselves to be. Both require the same level of insight into human nature, but they serve fundamentally different purposes and create fundamentally different outcomes. This is why developing observer consciousness comes with responsibility. Once you can see the patterns that govern human behavior, you must decide whether to use that sight to exploit those patterns or to navigate them more wisely. The knowledge itself is neutral. The application determines whether it serves constructive or destructive purposes. Here's what this means practically. When you recognize that someone's authority comes primarily from position rather than competence, you could use that recognition to undermine their authority for your advantage, or you could use it to engage with them in ways that allow them to maintain their position while still arriving at better decisions. When you recognize that someone responds more to demonstrated consequences than to abstract principles, you could use that recognition to manipulate them through artificial consequences, or you could use it to communicate with them in their actual language of motivation. The difference lies in whether your application serves only your immediate interests or serves the larger context that includes both your interests and others' legitimate needs. But here's what makes this ethically complex. Sometimes serving the larger context requires you to act in ways that challenge comfortable assumptions about how good people should behave. Sometimes protecting important long-term interests requires you to be less accommodating in the short term. Sometimes creating genuine mutual benefit requires you to establish boundaries that others might initially resist. This is where Machiavelli's insights become genuinely sophisticated. He understood that ethical behavior in complex situations often requires strategic thinking about consequences, not just adherence to simple principles. The leader who allows problems to escalate rather than addressing them directly isn't being virtuous by avoiding conflict. They're being irresponsible by prioritizing their comfort over their obligations. Similarly, the person who avoids honest conversations to maintain superficial harmony isn't being kind. They're allowing problems to compound until they become more painful for everyone involved. The person who enables destructive behavior rather than establishing appropriate boundaries isn't being generous. They're contributing to patterns that ultimately harm both themselves and the person whose behavior they're enabling. This recognition doesn't justify manipulative behavior or self-serving applications of power. But it does require you to expand your definition of ethical behavior beyond simple rule following to include the practical wisdom that considers consequences and serves larger purposes. The most ethically sophisticated people understand that genuine care for others sometimes requires decisions that others might initially find uncomfortable. They recognize that real kindness sometimes involves honest conversations that simple niceness would avoid. They know that authentic generosity sometimes includes boundaries that unlimited giving would reject. This level of ethical maturity requires you to distinguish between serving your legitimate interests and serving only your immediate preferences, between protecting important values and avoiding all discomfort, between being strategically intelligent and being manipulatively selfish. And this distinction becomes crucial as you consider how to live with the clarity that comes from understanding human nature accurately, how to use your growing insight to create better outcomes rather than just more advantageous ones for yourself. There comes a moment in developing this kind of awareness when you realize you cannot go back to naive assumptions about human nature, even when those assumptions were more comfortable. Once you've seen the patterns that govern most human behavior, once you understand the real dynamics behind influence and authority, once you recognize the difference between stated values and revealed priorities, you must decide how to live with this clarity. This is both the privilege and the burden of what we might call mature perception. You gain tremendous practical intelligence about human interactions, but you also lose the comfortable simplicity of assuming everyone operates from the same level of consciousness and consistency that you hope to maintain yourself. The question becomes, how do you use this understanding to create better outcomes rather than just more advantageous ones for yourself? How do you apply practical wisdom about human nature in ways that serve long-term flourishing rather than short-term manipulation? Machiavelli himself wrestled with this question. Despite his reputation as an advocate for ruthless pragmatism, his actual writings reveal someone deeply concerned with creating stable, prosperous societies. His observations about power weren't meant to help individuals exploit others, but to help leaders govern effectively enough to prevent the chaos and suffering that result from incompetent governance. This provides a framework for applying your growing understanding ethically. Use your insights about human nature to create more stability, more genuine cooperation, and more productive outcomes for everyone involved, including yourself. Here's what this looks like practically. When you recognize that someone responds more to demonstrated consequences than to abstract appeals, you communicate with them through actions and clear boundaries rather than endless explanations. This isn't manipulation. This is meeting them in their actual language of understanding, which serves both your need for effective communication and their need for clarity. When you observe that someone's influence comes primarily from position rather than competence, you engage with them in ways that allow them to maintain their position while still contributing your expertise to better decisions. This isn't deception. This is strategic wisdom that serves the larger purpose of achieving good outcomes while respecting existing structures. When you notice that someone's stated values don't align with their demonstrated priorities, you base your expectations on their revealed priorities while still encouraging alignment between their values and actions. This isn't cynicism. This is working with reality as it exists while supporting their development toward greater consistency. The common thread in these approaches is that they use accurate perception of human nature to create more honest, more productive, and more sustainable interactions. They serve your legitimate interests while also serving larger purposes that include others' well-being and development. But living this way requires continuous self-examination. You must regularly assess whether your applications of this understanding are serving constructive purposes or merely convenient ones. Are you using your insights about human nature to build better relationships and achieve better outcomes? Or are you using them to avoid the personal growth that would make manipulation unnecessary? This self-examination is crucial because the same insights that can make you more effective can also make you more subtly self-serving if you're not conscious about your motivations. The ability to recognize others' inconsistencies can become a way to avoid examining your own. The skill of reading power dynamics can become a way to focus on external control rather than internal development. The antidote to these temptations is what the ancient philosophers called phronesis, practical wisdom that balances accurate perception with ethical application. This means using your understanding of human nature in ways that serve your authentic development and contribute to others' authentic development, rather than in ways that simply maximize your immediate advantage. In practice, this looks like using your insights to become more consistent yourself, not just to exploit others' inconsistencies. It means applying your understanding of influence to build genuine authority through competence and character, not just to manipulate others' responses. It involves using your perception of power dynamics to create more equitable and productive relationships, not just to position yourself more advantageously within existing inequities. This approach doesn't require you to be naive about human nature or to pretend that everyone operates from the same level of consciousness and integrity. But it does require you to use your clarity about these differences to elevate interactions rather than to exploit them. The ultimate test of whether you're applying this understanding wisely is whether it makes you more capable of genuine relationships, more effective at worthwhile goals, and more able to contribute positively to the situations you encounter. If your growing insight into human nature is making you more manipulative, more cynical, or more focused on personal advantage at others' expense, you're misapplying the understanding. But if it's making you more discerning about relationships, more effective at constructive goals, and more able to navigate complex situations while maintaining your integrity, then you're developing genuine practical wisdom. This is what Machiavelli ultimately understood. The purpose of seeing human nature clearly isn't to become superior to it, but to work with it more skillfully in service of purposes that matter. The goal isn't to transcend the patterns that govern human behavior, but to engage with them consciously in ways that create better outcomes for everyone involved. And that choice, to use your growing clarity about human nature in service of construction rather than exploitation, development rather than manipulation, wisdom rather than mere advantage, is what transforms potentially dangerous knowledge into genuine practical wisdom. The patterns are there whether you see them or not. The question is what you choose to build with your ability to see them clearly.